Thank you, Steve Epley and music team. We create the world we live in. We create the world we live in. Believe it or not? Believe it or not? Does our world have suffering? In Unity, we have this statement that we co-create a world that works for all. Do you feel in your heart of hearts that this world that we create works for all? Truly, that's a question for today. Do we feel like the world that we create, that is of our creation, works for all? And if the answer is no, should it? Should it work for all? I believe it should. I believe that's one of the most beautiful things about the Unity teaching, the Unity message. Unity gives us a gift of self-empowerment, and it helps us look at our stuff. So when we meet the places in our lives where we're not working, we can be accountable for that. And we can begin activating internally a mind, a consciousness, and a life that works for this body being called me. What about the world around us? Where do the Unity principles bring us when we look at whether or not the world around us is working for all? Is it working for all of the people? Is it working for the environment? Is it working for the animal? Is it working for the future? How does the Unity practice lead us to co-create a world that works for all? Because we know when we inner work, we're working with our own consciousness. We're working in a realm where we have complete control over. Well, what about the realm where I interact with you and you interact with me? What about the realm where I interact with my world and my world interacts with me? Where do our Unity principles support us when we're looking at what we co-create? And whether or not we're creating a world that works for all, and how we might evolve as a species, as a consciousness, to begin to do so more deeply. We have a lot of funny ways in this human condition to fall and get back up and to judge each other in our world for what's working and what's not. But I believe it is really essential when we ask ourselves that question, is the world working for humanity? That we step out of judgment. We step out of the judgment that somehow leads us to think it should work for everyone just the way it is. It should work for everyone just the way it is. That I am somehow allowed to be in my own little separate worldview and say, well, this part of it works for me, or this part of it works for me, and say, because this part works for me, it should work for all. Is anyone in education? Try that with a child. Try creating the exact same environment, the exact same language, the exact same responses for every child. Try to create the same exact teaching strategy for every child, and look at the child and expect that they are going to either learn, how to develop their own spiritual power, learn how to create their own self-management system, learn how to even learn, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all experience, education, is it? So, as a teacher that looks at a classroom of children and says, this is how the classroom is, this is how I feel like teaching you, this is what I've created, now learn. Who's right and wrong is a judgmental thing, but who's right and who's wrong? Is it the student or is it the teacher? It's the teacher, isn't it? The teacher that stops looking at the interaction between the student and what they're putting out is the teacher that's short-sighted. The teacher that just says, well, this child just won't learn. I'm giving it. If there's anyone that has explored the idea of love languages, there's a great book out by Gary Chapman on love languages, and it talks about how we all have different responses. This same paradigm, the same human condition happens in relationships. Someone may be a giver of gifts, and they may keep giving gifts and keep giving gifts and keep giving gifts, and the receiver on the other end is just going, I'm not feeling loved. Just not feeling loved. But the giver of gifts is like, what are you talking about? You're not feeling loved. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent on you? Do you have any idea how many things I've gotten for you, or how much time and love it takes to actually pick something out that would make your heart sing? And I give it to you, and it just goes to the side. How are you not feeling my love? And someone else whose love language is quality time says, well, I never see you. We never spend time together. That gift was just laying on my pillow. I didn't even get to unwrap it in front of you. That doesn't feel like love to me. So in this human condition and in this culture that we create, we have human beings and we have a world, a planet. We have an environment, we have animals, we have all of life. Isn't it ours to make sure that it works for all? Isn't that just a basic idea that everyone should have their needs met? Everyone should have a way to prosper. It doesn't take that much, really, to meet our needs. We need food. We need clean food. We need clean food available to us. We need shelter. We need clean air and clean water. We need community. And then we need love. We need a connection. Pretty simple. That's pretty basic. But a lot of suffering comes from when we don't have these basic needs met. And a lot of that suffering also then can come, on another level. We can create our own suffering by our limited ideas and our limited thinking. And then there's another level of suffering that can be created by the natural pain of life, natural disasters and things happening. So when we look at what part we can control, what part we can step into consciously, we know that there is a great growing edge where we can create a world that works for all. The spiritual teacher Osho talks about our pain and what's not working. And he says this. He says, much of your pain is self-chosen. This is true. All of your misery, all your pain, much of it is not imposed by others. Against that which is imposed by others, he says, revolt. But that which you have chosen yourself, drop it. That which you've chosen yourself, drop it. He goes on to say, and there are pains which are natural, witness them. And witness them with sincerity, because it is the better medicine that nature, the physician within you, uses to heal your sick self. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. Nature heals, time heals. You simply wait and witness. He says, whatever is natural, against which no rebellion is possible, then don't be miserable, then accept it with gratitude. It is the invisible hand of the divine which wants to heal you, which wants to bring you to a higher state of consciousness. But whatever is unnatural, to yield to any kind of slavery is to destroy your own soul. One of my favorite unity ministers of the past is Reverend Sig Paulson. And he says this about the conditions that we create and our power in creating our world and our conditions. He says, man is the architect. It usually comes as a shock to discover that the outer conditions of life are largely the product of our own beliefs, thoughts, and feelings, and above all, the images we hold of ourselves, our neighbors, life, and God. To learn that conditions in body, home, human relations, bank accounts, community, and even international situations are the direct result of the images held in mind by mankind is a shock. Most of us probably credit life with being responsible for most of our difficulties. We might just be responsible for the good things that come to us, but the problems are obviously the work of some adverse power. We may even come up with a devil, a scapegoat of some kind on which to unload responsibility for our woes. Or we can even blame God, who, if some of his self-styled representatives are to be believed, takes a perverse pleasure in human suffering. But in the enlightened understanding we are entering, it is becoming more and more obvious that man is indeed the architect of his own world and is responsible for the shape he and his world are in to a much greater degree than heretofore dreamed. And as some of the more enlightened observers are discerning, man is going to be almost totally responsible for the shape of the world to come. In the imagination chamber of his own being, he will lay the foundations and draw the blueprints for the world of today and the world of tomorrow. He will draw the blueprints for the world of today and the world of tomorrow. So here we are, blueprint drawers. Blueprint drawers. If you were the master of the universe and you plopped right onto planet Earth, how would you spend your time? What would you do? Would you put yourself in school for 12 years from 8 to 4 and then get a job 5 days a week and work 40 to 60 hours a week? And then go to a grocery store and pick up some, I always think that the food should be called like regular food, and then all the other stuff should be labeled, and it should be like, with a little bit of poison, with a little bit of toxin. Just let us know what's in there. It's good, and then we can make our choices. But would we be doing this? Would we have systems like this? Once we know what we know about the human condition, we know that part of the human condition is that we can, even have times when we're lazy. Part of the human condition, or we call it lazy. That's a judgment. It could actually be, could it not, that there's part of the human condition, part of the human cycle that needs time for rest, that needs time to renew and restore? What about parts of the personality? There are all different kinds of personalities, right? Why shouldn't the world work for all types of personalities? Can it? And if you were the designer of the universe, what would you choose for all of us? This Sunday marks Epiphany, which is more of a traditional experience in the Catholic Church or in the traditional Christian church. But Epiphany is from the root word manifestation, the time of manifestation. And on the 6th, it was the Epiphany, and today often is celebrated the Feast of Epiphany. And in most traditions, this is a time to honor and celebrate the Christmas season, the end of the Christmas season. And then actually for some, Epiphany goes on and through Easter until Easter, and it marks this time up until Easter, this time of manifestation on the Sundays through Easter. But this idea of Epiphany is one, to do two things. One is to celebrate the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And the second thing is to acknowledge and celebrate the 3 wise men showing up at the birth of Jesus. Now, those are 2 stories that come to us as sacred text. And Charles Fillmore always talked about that the stories of the old days are nothing if they are not new to us right now. That they are completely invaluable if we sit there and we think about them being relevant to another person in another time in another place. That in fact, these stories come to us because they are mystical representations of the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of life. That they are our stories and they are here for us. So what do these two stories show us? What is the metaphysics behind Epiphany? Consider the possibility that it is about manifestation. That it is about the designing of life. John the Baptist, in the baptism of Jesus, had a recognition of the divinity within, a recognition that there is an enlightened state of consciousness, enlightened state of being, that one is awake. And that baptism represented that awakening. It represented the highest of the teachings of the peace shower, the master teacher. It was the acknowledgement that I and my source are one in flesh, that we are not separate from that which we call God, that which we call our source, that in fact we are the imaging of that source as creation. And then the three wise men. I mean, what a funny story, right? People just getting this call, getting this intuition, having dreams, following stars, showing up at a birth that maybe they weren't expected at, maybe they're not supposed to be at. But following that guidance, knowing that intelligence is all around and one can receive it and one can get it. And when one does, one creates what they are meant. One shows up where they are meant to show up. And an acknowledgement of our spiritual source on earth is experienced. Those two stories line up with, that idea of the first coming, that coming is represented in seeing that we have within us the awakened presence. Some call it the Christ. Some call it enlightenment. Some call it divine self. But that we are of that nature. That's the first coming, is getting that. And that's what the whole Christmas season is about. The whole Christmas season is about awakening the truth within and acknowledging that we are worthy, that we are of this love. We're not separate from it. That we are of intelligence, of wisdom, not separate from it. But what is the second coming then? What is the second coming? The second coming is that space where we behold the face of the divine within each other. And that is something celebrated at Christmas time. That is something celebrated in the Epiphany. When we can actually step into a space where we see in another the face of God. We are awakened on a whole nother level. There is a conscious community awakening. And once we have truly had that awakening, once we have truly had the Epiphany, that shows us what we are on this planet, what we are as beings, what our possibility is. There is no more separation. And our intention for each other becomes our intention for ourselves. Our intention for everyone on this planet is lifted up. It's our collective awakening. We now see the image of God in all of society, not just self. And that's the Epiphany. The recognition that this awakening is ours to be had together. And that we're here to follow our dream, our knowingness, to know our brothers as ourselves. Sig Paulson talked about this awakening. talking about our most powerful capabilities. He says this: the most powerful factor in the unfoldment of man, individually and as a race, as a collective, is the imagination. Man is the image of God. This does not mean that God is a superman and that each man is stamped out of some cosmic dough with a divine cookie cutter shaped like the Creator. You gotta love Sig. It means simply that man is the imaging end of the creative process. Man is the imaging end of the creative process. The individual self-expression of the unformed divinity, the creature confronted with the responsibility of its own unfoldment. And that the rest of the world as well, if we are willing to accept the viewpoint of scientists like Sir Alistair Hardy or the viewpoint of a spiritual leader like St. Paul, who pointed out hundreds of years ago that the whole world is in bondage and travail, waiting for the time when man comes into his own role. Waiting for the time that man comes into his own role. He goes on to say, men have forgotten the Creator and worshiped the created. They have, as Jesus pointed out, worshiped a God of form rather than the God of truth, spirit. The devil at work in the world today, as always, is the imagination of man gone awry. The present conditions in the world are an accurate outpicturing of the images man holds in his own mind. And the conditions will not permanently improve until man improves his image of the Creator, of himself, of his neighbor, and his world. That is our charge. That is our call. To improve the image of our world, of the collective, of what we can do when we co-create together. But how do we do that? How do we do that? We have to remember what our capabilities are, that we are here and we are designers, that what we might take as being solid, what we might take as being already created and unchangeable is just a fallacy, that in fact there is nothing that is unchangeable, that we design this life. We must keep looking. We must wake up from the illusion that there is one way, that things can't change, or that we're not in charge, that if the world doesn't work for us the way it is, that somehow we have to remain a victim. We've used these truth teachings so much in unity on an internal level, and now we have the call and the charge to use it and to create on an external level. Eric Butterworth says this. He said, truth works, but you must work at it. You must be willing to take a stand, follow a commitment, even if people do not understand and call you a dreamer. In your quest for truth, don't stop short with simply being entertained or pacified by peace of mind platitudes. Truth should disturb you, challenge you deeply. Truth should disturb you and challenge you deeply. The Buddha is known, this is an interpretation from the Buddha, that this statement, however many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do if you do not act on them? So if we say we are one, if we say we're here to co-create a world that works for all, what good does that teaching do for us if we don't act on it? So to remember that we are the designers of our lives, that if there's something that is not working, we can change it. The next is to keep looking, to keep learning, to keep researching, to keep ideating, to keep trying on, and to recognize that we live in a world of infinite possibilities, that the past is not right here and right now the same, that in fact there were different systems in the past, and there will be different systems in the future, and everything is up for our design. And the third is to embrace our own and our collective overcoming. We must refuse to be marginalized or to feel inferior simply because we have created a world that doesn't work for all the parts of ourselves. Because we have, in fact, created a world that has a bit of isolation in it, haven't we? There's a few things that don't work for a few people. Maybe more. There's no end to the cover of the book. It's not written yet. But as long as we feel like we can't overcome, as long as we allow ourselves to be marginalized or to feel inferior because our minds or our psyches or our brains or our systems or whatever our human condition is doesn't fit into the standard, then we are leaking our power. Our journey is to honor thyself and then to create what works for the self, rather than to try to put ourselves into that cookie cutter of what the world has to offer us for how we live this life on the planet, and then crucify ourselves because it's not working for us. Can you put yourself for a moment into the seat of that child in that classroom that doesn't learn like the teacher is teaching, or doesn't learn like the child next to him? Are we willing to stop telling ourselves that there's something wrong with us because something outside doesn't fit? And are we willing to truly step in to creating and co-creating the life that works for us, totally taking on that power, totally owning it? Wayne Dyer, in the book Excuses Be Gone, he says, it's one thing to make a pronouncement in a moment of inspiration about what you intend to manifest in your life or what person you intend to become. It's quite another thing to make a commitment to holding that vision regardless of the difficulties or obstacles that may surface. Holding the vision involves an unwillingness to compromise what you're visualizing for yourself and for our world. It means being willing to suffer through criticism and what appears to be an uncooperative universe. We are a divinity expressing. That is us. It's high time that we value the worth of which we were created, that we see it outside of us, and that we walk this planet day by day, moment by moment, in consciousness and in activity, creating the world that works for all. That's the Epiphany. Namaste.